How will we power our future? Can we create a healthy and clean economy? Climate One at the Commonwealth Club is at the forefront of the global debate about energy, economy, and the environment. Bringing together the brightest and most provocative leaders of our time, Climate One is the place where big ideas get heard. With thoughtful and insightful discussions on policy, business, science, and culture, Climate One founder Greg Dalton gets to the heart of the matter. It's our future. It's time to come together.
Why does an invisible, life-threatening virus prompt a global emergency, but invisible, life-threatening gases don't? For years, experts have been emphasizing the dangers of unchecked climate change, underscoring the need for bold international action to avoid the worst impacts. Now that is happening for COVID-19. We explore why humans are wired to respond to some fears and emergencies more than others. We'll hear from Peter Atwater, Adjunct Professor of Economics at the College of William and Mary, Susan Clayton, Professor of Psychology at the College of Worcester, and Robert Frank, Economics Professor at the Cornell S.C. Johnson College of Business and author of Under the Influence, Putting Peer Pressure to Work. And later in the show, we'll talk about what the spread of coronavirus teaches us about the spread of climate change, COVID-19 and climate, today on Climate One. I'm Greg Dalton, and I've been hosting Climate One conversations here at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco for more than 12 years, since I went to the Arctic on a global warming expedition. When I'm on this stage, I usually have a live audience in front of me and guests sitting right beside me. Today, we're doing it the way you're probably going about much of your work and social life, on video. Welcome to Climate One. Thanks for joining us, all three of you.
Good to see you, Greg.
Thank you, Greg.
Be here.
Well, Susan Clayton, you recently woke up in the middle of the night with a tickle in your throat. Tell us how you felt, what you did, and what you thought.
Well, I know what you're getting at, which is that my initial anxiety, I overreacted. I thought, oh no, I have the coronavirus. I'm doomed, essentially. And it took just a second or two for my rational mind to kick in and tell me that was very unlikely. But it's that instinctive reaction that I think explains a lot of the kind of reaction we see among other people as well.
And how does the reaction to this virus, which is invisible, how do you see that compared to this gas, carbon pollution, which is also invisible and deadly and harmful in a different way? How do you compare those two, our human responses?
Yeah, well, clearly we're responding a lot more strongly to the coronavirus than to climate change. Disease is a lot more immediate, a lot more scary than the idea that we're gradually destroying or harming the atmosphere and the ecosystem. So we definitely respond to that idea that our personal health is compromised. But I also think it's important to recognize that both of these things, because they are invisible, people are kind of relying on, they need to have the situation interpreted for them. So there's a really big role for the social media, for political figures and other people who are prominent and visible, to explain to them. In one case, we don't have a lot of people who are very prominent talking about how scary climate change is, but we do have a lot of people talking about how scary COVID-19 is.
Peter Atwater, you liken this moment where we have this looming threat, that you liken it to when Hurricane Katrina was barreling down on the Gulf Coast, and there's this big scary thing offshore. It's coming. We can kind of watch it coming our way. How do you compare that Katrina moment to what we've been experiencing with COVID-19?
So what you could see was that, particularly from an American perspective, when the virus was contained in China, that was the first narrative that went along with that. There you had an existential threat that was far, far away and really not a threat, with the view that it was contained. And what I could watch and see was the narratives brought it closer and closer to us in terms of proximity. And one of the things about threats is that our anxiety rises exponentially as threats become closer and closer to us from a perception standpoint. And so you could see the level of anxiety turn to panic as it went from being afar and contained to being near us to now being among us.
Right. I mean, I was a reporter in China in the 1980s and studied China. and I've heard of pandemics, but at no point when I read about Wuhan did I anticipate that it would come here and to have the impact. And I think maybe I'm ignorant of the science, and some people might feel that way about climate change. Robert Frank, how do you see the way individuals are responding to these distant threats and very different invisible threats?
Well, I think Susan hit it on the head with the distinction between what seems like a distant threat on the one hand. That's the way many people view the climate threat, and the virus threat, which is really quite immediate. I mean, you have 2 weeks from the time you're exposed to it to the moment you might be faced with a genuine threat to your life. And what we know is that people are just not very good at reckoning how to deal with threats that seem distant many years into the future. There's some interesting work by an economist at UCLA, Hal Hershfield. He shows people pictures of themselves that are digitally altered to simulate what they would look like at age 80 or so. And after having had a chance to study the image of yourself at age 80, people become much more future oriented in little experiments that he asks them to make choices between now and later. People are much more future oriented. So I think it's what Pigou called the faulty telescopic faculty. We can't look ahead and put adequate weight on the future. What's changed in recent years, fortunately, is that the extremity of weather events, the fires, the droughts, the floods, have persuaded many people that climate crisis is not a distant phenomenon at all. It's really upon us. And so I think many more people are willing to take seriously the fact that we need to take action to try to parry the threat that compared to 3 or 4 years ago, it's a much bigger change than I think I saw coming.
Robert, I want to ask you about whether you agree that sort of we're able to tackle right now big things like climate change. We have a question from Susan Barnett on Facebook. You know, how will this pandemic affect attitudes and policies about the ways in which our country can best proceed to deal with climate change?
You know, I think a lot of the resistance to taking action about climate change is rooted in the fact that it will be very expensive to really make a meaningful dent in the problem. And what this crisis with the coronavirus will have illustrated is that when we need to do something, cost is literally no object. If we must do something, we can do it. We're an incredibly wealthy country. The evidence from the very large and contentious literature on the determinants of human happiness suggests that beyond a certain point, and it's one we've long since passed in this country and in most of the West, further increases in most forms of private consumption don't really have any real impact other than to raise the bar that defines what we feel we need. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal. I lived in a 2-room house with no running water, no electricity. It never felt for a moment inadequate. If I lived in that house here, I'd be dismayed. I wouldn't want people to know where I lived. I'd be ashamed. The context matters enormously. Everybody wants to succeed. Succeeding is just a purely relative construct. To succeed means to do well relative to some norm. And if we needed to come up with literally $2, $3, $4 trillion a year to deal with a threat, we could do that without anybody having to make any enduring sacrifice at all. You know, the level of consumption would grow less quickly or would decline slightly for the people at the top of the ladder, and that would not be any hardship at all for them to adjust to.
In the Great Recession, in the stimulus package, there was a lot of money for renewable energy, that sort of thing. But then when the economy tanked, all of a sudden that appetite, we can't afford to get off fossil fuels now. It'll cost too much. We are in a recession now. It is going to be bad. Morgan Stanley said this recently. They predicted that could be 13% unemployment, 30% drop in GDP in 1 quarter. This is bad. It's going to be bad. Does that mean that America's appetite for going green is going to be decimated?
I think when we're in a period of slump, the appetite for spending on all manner of things gets decimated. The social progress that societies have made has most often come during periods of high economic growth rather than low economic growth. And I think that's been an issue in the climate movement. Many people say we've got to learn to live without growth in order to save the climate. But I think that's probably not the right way to frame the issue. What we know is that it's only growth in certain kinds of things that are damaging. And we really do have the policy levers to encourage growth in non-harmful activities and services and restrain growth in the ones that really cause harm, and have overall a healthy rate of economic growth, which we know politically makes it much more likely that societies will spend the money that they need to make real social and economic change with respect to climate or any other goal that we're trying to achieve.
We have a question from Sean Adderley on YouTube. Will the COVID-19 pandemic lead to more people working remotely permanently? That ends up reducing pollution by eliminating commuting. So perhaps there could be some behavioral changes here, Susan Clayton, that might stick and reduce carbon impacts.
Absolutely. And I wanted to take a bit more optimistic viewpoint, partly because that's something I just try to do in general. That one thing that happens in times of a recession is usually that carbon emissions drop dramatically. And so I think that there will be, there's already going to be probably some immediate benefits there. And in the slightly longer term, people will get used to doing things differently. I think when you have this kind of, we're at kind of a transition point, and so it will encourage people to rethink some things that they might not be willing to rethink if the economy was just purring along the way it had been. And that one in particular, I think, I'm guessing, but so many people have had to get used to virtual meetings, virtual business meetings, virtual travel. I think a lot of that will stick, and it might help a lot of business practices to become more efficient in that way.
Peter Atwater, you write about how, or talk about how there's episodes of repetition. If this is viewed as a one-time random thing and it goes away and we get through it, that's different than something that repeats like a hurricane after hurricane after hurricane. So how do you think about how much this behavioral and social change from this COVID crisis will stick?
So I think the lasting unknown question today is, as we handle this crisis, have people been traumatized by this? That perception that it could happen again. There's a lot of discussion that we will need a vaccine in order for the population to calm down about the potential risk of another pandemic sometime soon. So I think that vulnerability here with respect to the outbreak is going to be very important. Do we look at this as a one-time event, in which case we'll treat it as a shock, or is there some lingering sense that it could happen again? And there the impact could be quite profound, from people changing their consumption habits in terms of how much do you stockpile in your pantry? What are our expectations for businesses, for supermarkets, in terms of what is kept on the shelves? So there's the potential for profound change as we consider where we were vulnerable coming into this crisis.
Robert Frank, we're seeing a stress on one system right now, healthcare system, financial system. We think about climate change. Scientists tell us there could be multiple cascading system stresses and failures: food, water, et cetera. So, how do you think about that, and what the economic implications of what we're seeing right now as a big stress, and add on floods in the Midwest this winter? These things could really cascade.
Yeah, and I think the fact of all of those threats being so vivid and so visible now, really, you have to think about that as a possible opportunity. Very, very seldom does any really big change occur except in the wake of some sort of crisis or another. The Great Depression, for example, was not solved by the programs that FDR adopted, the WPA, the CCC. Those helped, but we didn't really get out of the Great Depression until the massive mobilization that we undertook during World War II. And I think once we're in the midst of the downturn that's coming in the wake of this coronavirus disruption, we're going to be in a depression that may even be much more serious and long lasting in threat, at least, than the one we faced in the Great Depression. And that's really an opportunity to mobilize, to undertake the kind of public investments that we really need to take if we're to have any realistic hope of parrying the climate threat.
Both COVID-19 and the climate crisis have global reach and visible perpetrators and require aggressive early action for containment. But while an infectious disease is acute and deeply personal, the impacts of a changing climate are systemic and indirect. Scientists point out that the coronavirus family, which includes COVID-19 and SARS, originated as an animal disease that can be passed along to people. With increased human development encroaching deep into natural lands, should communities be preparing for more pandemics? Joining us for a conversation on climate factors shaping human health are Brian Allen, Associate Professor of Entomology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, Aaron Bernstein, Interim Director of the Center for Climate, Health, and the Global Environment at the Harvard School of Public Health, and Barbara Gottlieb, Director of Environment and Health at Physicians for Social Responsibility. Ari Bernstein, you said that climate and COVID-19 are bringing forward some fundamental truths that we're having a hard time staring out. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I think what COVID is showing us is really that nature is trying to tell us something. Nature has given us a few shots over the bow here with emerging infections. COVID's the most recent example, but we've got MERS, SARS, HIV, pandemic influenza. These are all diseases that have come into people from animals. And if you look at these emerging diseases more broadly, it's the majority are wild animals. And so what ultimately is staring us in the face is the reality that we have taken advantage of nature to the point where we're putting ourselves at risk. And on top of that, we know very clearly what we can do to make a difference to prevent things like COVID. And among the things that really matter are climate solutions. And in fact, in many ways, pandemic solutions are climate solutions. And now is an important time to be talking about those.
So be specific. What are some things that could reduce pandemics that could also reduce carbon pollution and climate change? What are some of those co-solutions?
Well, a big one is deforestation. We think about tropical forest loss as sort of a moral crisis. What a terrible loss to everyone, and particularly to the species that are in tropical forests. But we know from many examples that chopping down forests increase risks of the spillover of pathogens from animals into people. We don't know that exactly with COVID, but in other bat diseases that have come out of bats, and Ebola, you may remember the most recent bad Ebola outbreak in West Africa, the evidence suggests that deforestation in West Africa actually may have pushed bats into parts of West Africa that they weren't in before. And as you may know, the most recent Ebola epidemic in West Africa was in a part of Africa that they haven't happened in before. And so, preventing deforestation is a climate solution. Preventing deforestation is also a solution to prevent disease emergence.
That's going to bring humans in contact with species and disease. It sounds like more people, more food, more land, more disease. What can be done about that? Is Brian Allen?
Yeah, and further compounding the issue is that some of the land we're currently using for agriculture may become less suitable for production as well under climate change. So not only will we need more land to feed a growing human population, but some of what is currently being used may become vulnerable to climate shocks. It's going to be an issue that is going to intersect with infectious disease emergence, because we've seen a pattern where development of natural areas, typically for agricultural production, but also for timber extraction, harvesting of other natural resources, creates inroads into those areas that facilitate human wildlife interaction. And so, for example, in Central Africa, logging creates roads that allows hunters access to areas that were previously inaccessible. They hunt wildlife for not only for subsistence consumption, but also for a global wildlife trade. And those are the contacts between humans and animals that keep disease biologists up at night, because those are the best opportunities for spillover events to occur. So you have humans hunting wildlife, coming in direct contact with the animals, butchering and consuming them. We think historically this is the way many infectious diseases have entered into the human population. HIV likely got its start through human consumption of non-human primates. Historical Ebola outbreaks likely followed a similar pathway. So not only do you have this issue of loss of natural area to agriculture, but it also creates more opportunities for humans to come in contact with wildlife than they had before. Interventions will require, regulation, try to enforce laws against wildlife consumption and wildlife hunting, but also, culturally sensitive approaches that take into account that the reasons people are hunting bushmeat could be driven by lack of economic opportunity and lack of alternative sources of protein. And so try to address the actual problem that's leading to these behaviors in the first place.
Barb Gottlieb, I think it's fair to say that if you ask an average American person about climate change, they would think about smokestacks, maybe polar bears, maybe tailpipes. They wouldn't necessarily think about human lungs or personal health. Why isn't, if we just heard there's such a strong connection between climate and personal health, why don't more people think of it that way in that frame?
Well, I think some people are still thinking about climate change as something that's either out there or in our future. Those are the images that we were given early on, and they still stick. So you mentioned polar bears. I'm afraid polar bears might still be, for a lot of people, kind of the iconic image of climate change. But really, what we're finding is that more and more people are recognizing that climate change is real, it's happening now, and it's affecting their health. So polling shows us that. And I think also people's lived experience is telling them that. So if you lived in California and you lived through the wildfires, you know what the impact was on air quality, on health. And in fact, some of the particulate matter that was generated from those fires blew all the way across the country and reached Baltimore. Every region of the country is having its own climate impacts. In the Southwest, it might be drought and heat, which, the heat effects can be as severe as heat stroke, which can be fatal. The Midwest experiences extreme storms and floods with water contamination, impact on agriculture, and so on, all the way across the country and all the way through people's lived experience. I think the tide has turned. I think people recognize climate change as a real problem. More and more people are recognizing it as essentially human caused. And they're seeing and they're feeling the health consequences. I certainly know that the doctors in my own organization are seeing more patients presenting with symptoms and diseases that they can link to climate change.
All right, Bernstein, you mentioned an accountable care organization. That was a new term to me when you said that, and then I looked it up a little bit and thought about, it's kind of like Kaiser or Mayo, where institutions have a financial incentive to invest in someone healthy today, so that they will actually, that company will accrue the future financial benefits of that person not getting sick down the road. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, right now, people often ask, why don't we do more in medicine to keep people healthy? I mean, we've got a $3 trillion healthcare bill every year. It's roughly 18% of GDP. Depending on where you look, the lion's share of that is preventable. Why don't we prevent all this disease and use a couple $1 trillion to do stuff we actually want to do, like give our kids an education? And the honest answer is doctors aren't incentivized mostly to keep people from getting sick. And so that needs to change. And COVID is a really good example, because how sick you get from COVID is largely dependent upon your age, and also whether you have a pre-existing medical condition like obesity or heart disease, which is overwhelmingly caused by things like smoking and unhealthy diets. It couldn't be clearer that prevention is worth a lot.
Rob Gottlieb, other bright spots, a lot of scare in this with COVID and climate. Where do you see some bright spots, some hope, some silver linings, dare I say that phrase?
I see bright spots in the fact that there really are solutions available to the problems that face us. With COVID-19, the solution is not coming fast enough. We don't have the cure that we wish we had. We certainly don't have the vaccines, but we know what steps we can take to protect ourselves, our neighbors, our communities, and really flatten the curve and decrease the risk and hopefully save lives. In regard to climate change, I think one of the things that we need to tell ourselves and to tell others is that there is hope possible. Yes, we're on a dangerous path, and yes, we really need to make very sweeping changes to protect ourselves. But we do know what those changes are that we need we need to make. So first of all, we have to and we can greatly reduce our use of fossil fuels. We can cut back on the use of oil and gas. We can transform our transportation system. We can transform our buildings so that they're much more powered by the renewable energy that we need to have. That's so the reduction in fossil fuels is kind of the negative part of the solution. But I'm really very cheered by the advances in the technologies and the accessibility of renewable energy and energy efficiency. Let's remember that renewable energy is it's clean, it's safe, and it's it's like manna from heaven. If you'll allow that comparison, solar energy really is one of the ultimate mannas from heaven. And energy efficiency has been called the cheapest energy that you never have to buy. So there are paths forward. That to me is one of the silver linings. I think there are two other lessons or comparisons that we can make again between the COVID-19 pandemic and the threat of looming climate change. One is that I think that we're coming out of our current experience with the understanding that science really does matter. Science matters and doctors matter. We've got valuable, useful information and trusted messengers. And then the second thing that I think we're learning is that we have, as a society, we have to make our decisions about big threats that face us based on fact. We can apply what we know. We have the facts. We have the messengers, and what we have to do is turn that into the big levers for changing society, which is both personal actions and also our policy. And I think that if we do those things, if we learn from the experience at hand, we really can give ourselves a much safer, healthier future.
Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you get your pods. Please rate, subscribe, review. I'm Greg Dalton. Thanks for joining us online. We'll see you next time, everybody.